Welcome. My name is Dr. Tyna Moore. My guest today is Krishnan, and we are talking about leaky gut and pain, how it relates to pain. And in this half-hour webinar, we're going to just address some common ideas and concepts about how your gut and your pain are intimately related. Kiran is the CEO and research microbiologist and clinical researcher at Microbiome Labs. And you are the creator of Megaspore Biotic, is that correct? Your company has made this wonderful product that I'm a huge fan of. So welcome, Kiran. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. It's always great to get any time to be able to talk with you.
Awesome. Well, we had so much fun on my podcast before, and so I thought we could do a quick half-hour webinar just to introduce the audience to this concept. This is something I've actually lectured about at several orthopedic conferences to MDs and DOs, and every single time they're sort of left with this jaw-dropping look on their face, like, how does my gut relate to my pain? And as a naturopathic physician, I know that the gut is intimately related to all aspects of health, which you guys so wonderfully, bring together with your products. So I thought we could just talk about a couple simple concepts for the audience to understand, and then talk about how your product might be helpful for those things. So let's start.
Let's do it.
All right. Sounds good.
So
go ahead.
Yeah. Did you want me to? Oh, you had a question for me, so you go ahead.
Well, I just wanted to first, why don't you describe to the audience what leaky gut is? Because that's such a big term that people throw out there, and I think it's intestinal permeability, but I'm going to let the researcher say it.
Yeah. So we define it typically in research as intestinal hyperpermeability, because the intestines are supposed to be permeable to some degree. Of course, we absorb most of our nutrients and all that through the intestinal lining. So it's fine that it's leaky in a way to some degree, but a lot of the nutrient absorption and all that is controlled in many ways. So there are specific channels in which the nutrients move through, and also there are carrier systems. For example, dietary fat has these what we call lipid rafts that actually grab the fat and take it in. So these are active transports or controlled transports. When your gut is not healthy, which I would say, probably over 70–80% of people who are 30 and above, and certainly anyone that has any sort of symptomology like pain or inflammation, any sort of inflammatory conditions, then the gut becomes hyperpermeable, meaning anything and everything that is of a certain size can just kind of non-specifically leak through. And the problem with that is the gut is supposed to act as a major barrier between the outside world and the inside part of your body, which is the circulatory system. And the moment it leaks past the intestinal lining, it's entering something called the basolateral layer, which is where your blood system is. So imagine toxins and bacterial components and viral components, all that's moving through your digestive tract can actually leak through and end up directly into your blood. And once it's in your blood, your immune system freaks out because it feels like there's an invasion coming in, and then you develop this entire cascade of issues. An interesting thing about leaky gut, there's another fancy word for it. It's called metabolic endotoxemia, and that basically defines leaky gut that occurs as a result of eating food. So every time you eat a meal, just the process of digestion alone and the presence of food, which is essentially a foreign object, causes disruption to the bacteria within the gut, causes inflammation and an inflammatory response in the intestines, and that causes a lot of toxins and things like that from the food to leak in. And you can actually measure that right after a meal.
Oh, wow. That's, it's interesting because we were sort of taught that inflammation in the gut from the standard American diet can definitely, and the way that we describe it in simple terms to patients is what you described, which is, stuff that's supposed to stay inside the gut ends up on the outside. The immune system freaks out, mounts an inflammatory or immune response, and then on goes the cascade. What I see in my practice clinically is pain. So I see people coming in and I'm sort of their last stop. They're coming in for regenerative injection therapies and I'm the last stop on the parade. They've been to generally their general practitioner who punts them off to a specialist, who punts them off for imaging, who punts them off for more consult. If they're lucky, they get in to see a physical therapist and they get some kind of rehab introduced, but more often than not, they get the option of cortisone or surgery, which is to me so barbaric. I think there's such a huge gray zone when it comes to actually treating the joints. But what most people don't understand, and this is why I turn away about 7 out of 10 patients for treatment, is because most of their pain is being driven by some sort of systemic mechanism. And the leaky gut idea is something, the intestinal hyperpermeability is something that I describe to them in simple terms. But they still, it's a big concept to wrap your head around. What I think I'd like to introduce to the audience is, how does that translate into inflammation? And then how does that translate into that sort of neuroimmune mediated joint? Like, we actually end up with inflammation in the joints and pain, and it might even just be neurogenic inflammation. It doesn't necessarily have to be that any sort of laboratory markers are showing up with inflammation. It's just that their joints are, what I say, quote unquote, on fire. They're angry and they're upset. And so I'm introducing substances into the joint through injection to try to calm things down. But the root cause of the problem is stemming from their gut. And it might not even be their diet. They might be eating beautifully. And something that you blew my mind with on our podcast last time was that these lipopolysaccharides, and how even if you're eating really good food, depending on your biome in there, you might be producing lipopolysaccharides, which are sort of driving the show. In a nutshell, in a kindergarten term. But that's what blew my mind, was that every single time people are eating, they're potentially producing these lipopolysaccharides, which are driving this ship. So I know that's a big idea, but can you break that down?
Yeah, so let's talk about the lipopolysaccharides. So these are what we call endotoxins, and the reason we call them endo is because they're generated within the body itself, versus like an exotoxin would be one that's coming in from the outside. Exotoxins are easier to deal with because if we know the source, like it's mold or it's chemical plant near the house, we can avoid those things, or we can move away or something. But when it's an endotoxin, there's nothing we can do about it being generated from the inside. And it basically comes from the vast majority of good commensal mutualistic bacteria that live in your gut. All bacteria can be classified into 1 or 2 categories, which is a gram-negative or gram-positive. It's not important what that means, but gram-negative bacteria have this compound within their cell membrane structure that is very useful to the bacteria. It's used for communication, it's used for binding, all of these things, and it doesn't cause a problem until it's released out of the cell wall structure of the bacteria. So what happens is, anytime the gram-negative bacteria dies, the cell breaks open, and then all these little endotoxins that were sticking in the cell membrane would be released now, and is a free-floating endotoxin. And the thing that's important to note is that somewhere around 70–80% of the 100 trillion or so bacteria that live in your gut are gram-negative, so they contain this endotoxin. So you've got a huge amount of this endotoxin sitting in your gut at any given time. Now, for the most part, if your gut is super healthy and your lining is super healthy, your mucosal layer is super healthy, they all act as barriers to prevent this endotoxin from going in the intestines, leaking through and entering the blood system. But as I mentioned before, 70–80% of us have leaky gut, especially as you become older, and if you have defined conditions like even things like allergies, asthma, any sort of digestive issues, inflammatory conditions, or as you're saying, pain, is indicative that there's likely a leaky gut going on. So what happens is, then when you eat food, and food is one of the harshest, digestion of food is one of the harshest process of the gastric system. Because a lot of acid is released, bile salts, pancreatic enzymes, all of those things kill off bacteria. Food is moving through, there's all of this churning and motion going on. So with all of that, this bacteria dying off constantly. And as they die off, they keep releasing this LPS. So the process of eating food is releasing LPS, and then if your gut is leaky, all that LPS is moving through and into your circulatory system. And so what we've been able to show, and other studies have shown this before as well, that after you eat, it's called postprandial or metabolic endotoxemia, because within 3 to 5 hours after you eat, you can actually measure somewhere around a 500–600% increase in endotoxins in your blood.
Wow.
Right? And it's very, very measurable. It's a 5–6x increase Now, what's crazy about that is University of North Texas, who we worked with to do our first study, they showed that from a single meal, it actually took the body 2 weeks to recover from it in terms of the inflammation and all of the toxicity that happened from that one meal. Took about 2 weeks to recover from, and we're eating, 3-4 times a day, so we never recover from it. It's a constant uprising of toxins moving into your system, and then all of the inflammatory response that follows the toxins. When we studied this, we measured about 16, I think, different inflammatory markers. All of them rise up significantly in response to the presence of a toxin. Some of them, like interleukin-1 beta, is the number one target right now for cardiovascular research, especially in the drug world, because what they're finding is no matter what the person's condition is, if they have high levels of interleukin-1 beta in the vessels, they end up with plaques. So interleukin-1 beta causes plaque formation. So this is the number one target for cardiovascular research. And so, this horrific toxin increase with all of the inflammatory cytokines come along with it happens in every single day, every time we eat food. And what people don't realize is that presence of that toxin and all the inflammation that goes along with it are major drivers of chronic pain. And without addressing that, there are things you can do to manage the pain, but without addressing that continuous outpouring of pro-pain signaling from the gut, we're never going to shut off the pain valve.
It's so funny you say that, because I tell my patients that, I say, we can do all the work and you can spend all these dollars, because the services I provide are not covered by insurance. So people are paying harder in cash. And it's amazing how compliant people get when suddenly they're plunking down, hundreds to thousands of dollars. But I tell them the same thing. I'm like, I can't put out the fire with even the best tools if you keep pouring lighter fluid on the situation. And it really is propane. It's constant, and we'll be 2 or 3 rounds into PRP. And every time I inject a person, not only can the procedure be somewhat uncomfortable, I mean, in truth, I'm a good injector and I make it as comfortable as possible, but you're still going through a procedure. And then on top of it, you've got to take a few weeks off of exercise, which for people like yourself and I who are active, that's crazy making.
Right.
And then 2 or 3 rounds in, I'm like, why are they not getting better than I expected? Because usually I'm pretty good at predicting. And I look at them and I'm like, how's your sugar intake? What about basically I tell them what the doctors of old said, which is get off white foods. When you have joint pain, you get off white foods, sugars, breads, refined carbohydrates, etc. And I'll say, what's going on with the sugar and the white foods? And they'll be like, oh, well, I can't give up my ice cream at night, and I can't give up my bread, and I can't. And it's just like, well, you're driving a fire. You're throwing lighter fluid on it. And I do it too. I mean, the moment I start having chronic joint pain, which I suffer from, I back up and think, what have I been eating? It's the first thing. What have I been putting in my mouth? But even with healthy foods, if your biome is really shifted in a sort of pathologic way, let's take me, for example. I grew up in a Midwestern family, eating really a lot of refined foods, eating a lot of frozen vegetables. Then in my teenage years, I decided to starve myself and live off of carbohydrates. I was a mac and cheese-atarian. I just decided I was vegetarian, but I really just lived off of carbs and dairy and cigarettes. And, thank God I gave up soda. I just didn't drink any soda. But I shifted my biome in such a permanent way that I created a whole arsenal of issues for myself down the road. And shifting that biome back has been incredibly difficult. I have tried every product. Honestly, most products I go on, and I've tried them all, cause me either a lot of duress right away, like it's concerning. I need to start very, very slowly and ramp up, or I don't notice much of anything. And your product was really easy to go on to, which was big for me. It was really easy to start. It was really easy to ramp up. And when I take a little too much, I back off, because I realize this is a process of ramping up. Because when you start to shift that biome and those bad bugs are no longer thriving, they lyse and they release more endotoxins, and you get a Herxheimer reaction, which no matter how much you warn patients against what a Herx reaction is, it's very unpleasant. I'll let you tell the audience what that is.
I mean, it's really, I mean, it's a die-off. It's your body going through a healing crisis. And from a bacterial standpoint, it's their last stand. You know, they're getting driven out, they're getting defeated, and so they will make a last stand to try to you know, maintain their position and fight off. It's like a war going on, and so they throw off all their bombs that they have as a Hail Mary to try to survive. And again, if your system's not, you know, completely intact and your liver's not clearing toxins well, if your pancreas isn't healthy, if your gut is leaky, all of those things are going to, you know, cause you to feel, you know, not so well for a couple of days because of the die-off reaction. But, you know, and we see that to some degree with certain people with the product, but the whole point is that we can make a real functional change within the microbiome and start reverting the biome back towards the way it was supposed to be before we went on this, you know, campaign of hurting our gut, which all of us did in our teenage years, early 20s and all that. You know, you mentioned all the dietary crazy things we all did. I did the same kind of stuff, and we all went through multiple rounds of antibiotics, you know, throughout our teens and early 20s and even before that. And all of those rounds of antibiotics all have a huge compounding effect to take us to this point where we all have this leaky gut. And it's, you know, not only is it a big driver for pain, it's also the #1 driver for most chronic illnesses like heart disease, diabetes, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, you know, so most things that people are dealing with come from this leaky gut. You know, and pain is interesting because there's two really special connections to leaky gut and pain. The first one is through inflammation. So one of the things I mentioned, that leaky gut causes all of this systemic inflammation, right? So it can cause, like you said, inflammation in your joints, like wherever that toxin, that LPS, once it gets into your body, it can swim around and float around and get basically into every tissue. It gets deep into the recesses of the brain. It gets into like areas like the amygdala, the hippocampus. It can get into your joints. It can get into your lung tissue. All of these areas, and wherever it settles in, it causes a massive inflammatory reaction because your body recognizes that as a bacterial component, and so it thinks there's a bacteria invading your system. And there's now bacteria that's growing in your joint, so your body mounts a really horrific inflammatory response to try to protect you, but that inflammatory response then causes a whole bunch of pain in the area because, you know, the pain signal is something called lipoxygenase cascade, and the cyclooxygenase cascade is a pain. Lipoxygenase is the inflammation, and they're parallel pathways. They both start at something called arachidonic acid. And so when you have a significant amount of inflammation being generated by the immune system, the thing to follow that is pain, because your body's trying to tell you, hey, something's wrong with this part of the body, right? Pain is really a signal to warn you to protect yourself. And so you can't have inflammation without pain occurring. So that goes hand in hand. Now, the more fascinating thing to me is this LPS itself, as I mentioned, can get into almost any part of the body. One of the areas it loves to get into are the neurons. And it can be through the central nervous system. It could be actually in the brain, or it could be in the peripheral neurons in your extremities, in your legs, fingers, toes, and all that. Once it gets into the neurons, it can actually get into the dorsal root, which is kind of the root part of the neuron, and it can stimulate something called nociceptors, which send off pain signals. So imagine this little toxin is going in and pushing a pain button in your neuron constantly, and every time you eat, you're letting a whole bunch of these LPSs in, and they're going around and embedding into your nerves and stimulating the pain button. So you can have all of this kind of what I call kind of phantom pain, because you don't really know what the cause is. You just feel pain, and you can't necessarily know what the injury, there's not necessarily an injury intimately tied to it. And then it can migrate from place to place. People feel pain sometimes in this side and other times in the other side. And then they can get kind of this systemic kind of effect, which is in the case of fibromyalgia, things like that. We're just feeling pain all over, and all of that is caused by when you eat food, LPS comes in and goes around and wreaks this havoc in your body. And like you mentioned earlier, it can happen when you eat healthy food too, which is, it's because it's a dysfunction of how your gut lining is supposed to be working. And so if you eat a greasy hamburger, it's going to increase it by 600%. If you eat a kale salad with avocado, it's going to increase it by 300%. So it's less of an impact, but it's still going to do it. And the whole thing and our focus was, how do we fix that lining so that LPS stops going from the intestines into the circulatory system?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned the dorsal root ganglion, because that's, the way that TENS units work, or the way that even dextrose works, the injections that I do, they decrease neurogenic inflammation. And somebody asked me the other day, what is neurogenic inflammation? And I let them know it's basically the nerves are angry and the nervous system is angry. And so I'm quelling that fire, but it's temporary. There is a regenerative effect with dextrose as well, so we can start to heal those tissues. But if somebody, again, is continuing to just pour lighter fluid on the fire from the inside, we don't really get very far very fast. And then something that I really want the audience to understand, if they jump to something like PRP, which is platelet-rich plasma or stem cells, they might actually be concentrating. I tell them this in these words. I say, your shoulder, your knee, or your hip, it's basically a hot mess of inflammation right now. I can tell just by looking at the person that that's what they're dealing with. If I concentrate down their cellular system, their blood, their fat cells, their bone marrow, and I shoot that concentrated fire into the hot mess, we're going to have a big hot mess. So we don't even calm the nerves down. And people want to go for the big guns. They come in, I want stem cells. And I'm like, you really need to start with dextrose. You really just need to start. Let me calm it down and heal it. It's almost like a salve. And then let me address what's going on with you on the inside. Because if we start throwing concentrated fireballs into joints, we have a big, and this is my bit, you've seen my platform online where it's like, if you don't take care of yourself holistically, there's no point. Your cells are kind of not very functional. Your stem cells are not very potent, and it's kind of a moot point. So this is where really, again, it comes back to the gut. And regardless of best, I've been that person who's eaten really religiously healthy, and I still had chronic pain. And when I finally came upon your work, I was like, there's few moments in my career where I'm just, you can hear it in the podcast we did together. I was just so excited because I realized, like, wow, this is the missing link. This is really what I've been dealing with. This is the reason I think you and I have talked about intermittent fasting, but I think this is one of the, and maybe you tell me if I'm right or wrong, I think this is one of the reasons intermittent fasting is helpful for people, is because you're actually starving the gut for a period of time long enough to let the immune system and the nervous system and everything else calm down. Is there some validity to that?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, basically you're shutting off the pain tap for a period of time, which gives your body a little bit of time to recover and starts bringing the inflammation down. But the other thing you're doing is also increasing something called autophagia, which is, kind of the self-cleaning mechanism that the body has, so that it can start to clean out, dead and dying tissue and, broken DNA and things like that. All these kind of damaged cells, the body can start trying to clear it out. So it gives your body a little bit of time to recover. And the problem is the next time you eat, it'll just kind of come back. And for us, there's so many things you can do to improve your lifestyle in general, your diet, your exercise, and all those things that are extremely important to live an overall healthy life. But there's very few things that have actually been shown to be effective at stopping that endotoxemia, that LPS from entering from the gut into the circulatory system. And that's why we focus so much on it, because we saw, with doctors like you who are running practices where you're doing all of these things, utilizing all of these tools on your patients and helping them change their lifestyle and all that. But if that LPS is continuously leaking in, you're always falling kind of one step back, because we're not shutting that source off. And so our focus has been shutting the source. And we've been able to show it clinically in a published study that we actually shut the source, and it's the first of its kind clinical trials that have shown some compound to actually be able to shut that off.
And that's the Megaspore biotic. That's the spore. You talk about them like they're, you said last week, you were like, I'm going to India to see my spores. Talk about it a little. Explain what this product
is. Birthplace. Sure. So Megaspore is it's a unique probiotic. It's made with Bacillus endospores. So these are fairly unique strains into the U.S. market. But mind you, they've been in the market since 1958. They were and still are prescription drugs in Europe, Latin America, in Southeast Asia. Big pharma companies like Sanofi, Aventis in those parts of the world have been using them for treatment of inflammation, gut infections, and so on as drugs for well over 60 years. And when we came across the efficacy of these kind of strains, we were looking to see what companies in the US had them, and we found nobody was really marketing or creating a product and studying a product that was based around these unique strains. And what makes these strains unique is that they have this capability of forming a endospore, which is kind of a armor-like coating around themselves when they're outside of the body. So they are native gut bacteria that move out of the body from time to time through defecation. And so when they move out of the body, because they're not, designed to live optimally in the outside world, they prefer to live in the gut. When they move out of the body, they put this armor-like coating around themselves. So then they're protected by being able to sit out there in a harsh environment like the desert or the dirt or in rivers and streams and remain viable until they're re-swallowed again. And our ancestors swallowed lots of these guys every single day because our ancestors are smart enough to eat dirt, and they just kind of foraged, and that's what really kind of helped with human evolution, is their ability to incorporate all of these microbes into their system that provided all these interesting functions.
Yes.
So just from eating dirt and digging for roots and tubers and all that, and not sterilizing everything that went into their mouth, they got huge doses of these bacteria. So we developed this amazing symbiotic relationship where we provide these bacteria a home, and then they fix and clean that home for us. And then that's basically what they do. So what we saw was the potential ability of these strains to get into a damaged gut. And then do three major things. The first thing was typically a damaged gut has an imbalance of good and bad bacteria. So the idea was, can these bacteria actually fix that imbalance? Can they specifically get rid of bad bacteria and then enhance the growth of good bacteria? And as it turns out, they do that. So they can target bad bacteria. They know what they look like. They use something called Quorum Sensing, which is a bacterial way of reading each other's signatures. They find those bad bacteria, and they directly target them and destroy them, and then they produce prebiotics to grow the good bacteria. Now, at the same time, they're also modulating the immune system in the intestines to calm down all of that inflammatory immune response when things like food and beverages and all that enter the body. And then the third part is they actually seal up that lining. So they're actually stopping that leaky gut. So in the study we did and we published in August of last year, we showed that in just 30 days of taking the probiotic without any other changes. So, these people were not seeing a doctor like yourself who was getting all these wonderful lifestyle changes. They were, an average 22, 23-year-old college kid. So they're not doing anything good for their gut in that 30-day period. And so they're still, eating crap the whole time, drinking, being stressed. And all they did was take the probiotic, and after 30 days, we were able to shut down the LPS going into the system by 60%.
Wow.
And that's just in 30 days. And so huge measurable change in the amount of this toxin entering the body after eating a meal. And we gave all of them, a really harsh fast food meal as a challenge there, because we knew, the more processed, the more caloric the meal was, the more toxin you'll generate. So it was quite profound.
Can I ask real quick, how did you dose them? What was the dose on that?
So we just did 2 caps a day. They took the 2 capsules a day at the same time with any meal of the day. So we told them they could take it with your breakfast, lunch, or dinner. It didn't matter. And that's all they had to do. They didn't have to do anything else, no dietary changes or anything. And we were actually a little nervous. We didn't know. We knew the product was powerful. We saw it in the clinics we work with all the doctors that we worked with. But in a trial, you want to have hard and fast data. You want to be able to prove it by measuring stuff in the blood and seeing a significant change. We weren't sure if we would see a change in 30 days because these people are going out there and drinking and partying and stuff all, for most of those 30 days and being stressed out and not getting enough sleep, all the things we know that damage our gut. And we were very nervous and curious to see if even under that condition, can we revert people's guts to being completely protective? And the average reduction was 60%. We had so many of the subjects, they had a complete 100% reduction in LPS coming into the system. So in 30 days, it completely changed.
That's amazing, because I always joke that my gut was ruined in college. I mean, it was going that way before, but college was pretty much what did it. And then more subsequent college. You have a lot of years in school as I do, and it's like you just keep collecting degrees and more dysbiosis.
Exactly. Yeah. So the gut pays for it, and college and postgraduate stuff all becomes the nail in the coffin for the gut.
Yeah.
And then we pay for it in our 30s, 40s, and 50s, with all the chronic illness.
That's when, and then a young woman goes into childbearing years and blah, blah, blah. And young men end up in this sort of andropause situation as they go into their 40s. And I mean, I just see this over and over in practice. See, I see people's joints behaving the way you're describing, but I understand, as you do, this is what's happening system wide. And what I'm trying to tell them in the short amount of time that I have with them is that what's happening in your gut is happening in your brain, it's happening in your heart, it's happening in all of your systems. And it's the same degradation, it's the same inflammatory sort of bomb throughout the body. And if your joints are screaming, you can bet that you've got other issues going on that are going to catch up with you eventually. So I think it's, sometimes pain is the wake-up call. I always tell patients, like, if that's your lightning rod, but that doesn't necessarily mean that's all that's happening. It's just that thank God you have that signal. When your back or your knees or your hip light up, then you can, if you're leading a relatively clean lifestyle, or at least somewhat, I mean, even though you travel and you're in different time zones all the time, and I've got a busy schedule, I have a pretty good handle on my diet, and I have a pretty good handle on my habits at this. I have to, I don't really have a choice. Otherwise I suffer. But this is a really nice product to add in as backup insurance, so to say, because we can't always control all the variables. And even with our best intentions, like we've covered, eating a really clean diet, if your gut's set up a certain way, that can be, and the bottle says, I think 2 caps a day, right? Isn't that the recommended dose? It comes in a third
dose. Yeah, it comes with 60 capsules, so that's 2 a day for a 30-day supply. And really, at the end of the day, what we're looking at is getting to the root cause of these problems. And once you stop that pain tap or that inflammation, flow, then all of the other things that people are doing with their dietary changes or therapies all become much more effective. Because you're not always taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. So it's paramount to stop that flow. There was a study published in 2015 in the Frontiers of Immunology and it was a review paper. It just looked at a whole bunch of research involving this subject of leaky gut and this bacterial LPS getting into the system and causing all this inflammation. They concluded, based on their analysis, that this type of leaky gut with the LPS getting into the system was the #1 cause of mortality and morbidity worldwide.
Wow.
It's the #1 driver of death and disability in the world, because it's the cause of the top 2 neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. It's the cause of heart disease. It's the cause of diabetes. It's the cause of a whole array of cancers. It's a cause of most immune dysfunctions. And so this LPS getting in is such a significant dysfunction in the Western world. And, and so being able to stop it, even to some degree, helps quite significantly.
Absolutely. Well, I'm really excited. I've been taking it for several weeks now, and I'm floored. I'll just be really transparent. I have a long-standing history, regardless of what I eat. The only way that I can avoid this has been through long-term fasting, which leads me to being too thin and, really losing my gains in the gym, because it's important to me that I get the nutrition I need or I can't lift the weights that I want to lift. Has been long-term fasting. Otherwise, I end up by about 6 o'clock at night with a really bloated, uncomfortable stomach. And you can ask anyone who's close to me, I just don't want to eat at that point and I spent a long time anorexic. And I think that my anorexia was really due to this, what you're describing, because every time I ate, I felt horrible and I felt depressed and I felt anxious. And when I think the first few times I saw you speak on different podcasts and I read some of your information, I was just blown away, because I was like, oh my gosh, this is really, I think, something I've been suffering with. And then I couldn't wait to get my hands. I don't know why it took me so long to get my hands on the product, but once your staff was great in offering it. I just kept somehow missing the boat. But once I got my hands on a bottle of it, I started taking it and I started giving it to my daughter. And I shared with you earlier, she's had some gut issues. Yeah. And really just, it's almost like a salve. First, I mean, I'll just be really straight, like just taking a capsule or two immediately stops my stomach ache. And then subsequently I was getting a lot of, I thought it was really that middle-aged middle, which is just kind of that middle-aged woman belly. And I was really confused by it because I'm really active and I eat well. It's gone away. Like I literally looked in the mirror the other day. I'm like, oh, there's my figure. There's the, And it was bloat, and it was this. It was, I could tell it was coming from my gut, and I was saying to my naturopathic physician, I was saying to my boyfriend, like, something's wrong. And I had just gotten kind of into a cycle after a trip out of country where my gut was really being unhappy, more so than regularly. But that evening time bloat, it's gone. My pain is still somewhat the same, but I'm working on that. You know, that varies depending on lifestyle and everything else. So I'll report back, but I'm really impressed. And I have taken most of the products I've taken, I'll tell you, have been very detrimental to me. Most of the time people will say, here's the probiotic, you got to try it. I think that's probably why I was scared to try this, because I saw you years ago on Rebel Health Tribe. Discussing this, and I'm like, there's no way. Every time I've taken that product, I had a patient commit suicide because of a product that was supposed to be some amazing thing that ended up really messing up his gut and turning, really putting him into a downward spiral emotionally. And so I'm always a little hesitant about the really potent gut stuff, because I think, oh my gosh, this is going to be painful. I don't want to derail. But it's been a very easy transition onto the product, and I'm ramping it up. And I'm, after talking to you, and we don't have to get into it here, but we can talk about it again. You were mentioning like your adrenal glands and your overall health and the higher doses that you take. And I want to talk to you about that next time you're on my podcast. I think that, again, this just goes back to our naturopaths have known for decades that health starts and ends in the gut. And so it's really exciting to see a product that is accessible to patients. And this is only through healthcare practitioners. Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly. We don't sell it retail anywhere. It's only through healthcare practitioners, which to us is important, because we truly believe and subscribe to the idea that everyone should be getting their supplements through a healthcare practitioner. Because supplements, like you just gave an example. I mean, they're presumed to be just overall safe, but that's not necessarily true. And also just the efficacy and, whether or not they're going to be effective, if they're high quality, all of those things are vetted for you if you get it through a practitioner that knows what they're doing. And so when we launched the product, the easiest thing in the world would have been to start putting it on Amazon and all the websites and all that stuff. But we painstakingly go to conferences where we meet doctors like yourself, and we do presentations, and we meet one-on-one and introduce the product to them. I mean, like last year we did 83 conferences. That's almost 2 a week, and that's a lot of time, a lot of travel. But we think that's the most appropriate way for people to be getting their health and nutrition. So absolutely, it's only available through doctors, and and then people like you can make it available to your patients.
Yes. So I've got 2 links on my website, and one is for patients who are interested in taking the product, and one or the public through my link, or practitioners who are interested in wholesaling this or making this available to their patients through another link that will directly put them into your website, which is the Microbiome Labs. You guys have some great research on that page. I went through your website, and I mean, it's all there. There's white papers, there's research that's available to the public and to physicians. So I encourage everybody to go check that out. I'm a big fan so far, and I like I said, I have to submit to every treatment that I prescribe. I'm a big believer in being the guinea pig first. So I am really excited to order several bottles to put them on my shelves, because I think, honestly, I would like patients to take this product at least a month ahead of time, and then 2 weeks to a month ahead of time before I treat them, because I think even that will just start to calm things down. Going into a hot joint with a needle is not a pleasant experience for patients.
Yes.
Anything I can do to to bring it down. So, well, thank you so much for being on today. This was really enlightening, and I've got a prior podcast, and then you and I are going to be meeting up in a week or so for another podcast, which this webinar will be evergreen. And so watching that, I'll make sure to put the episode numbers on there so you guys can go back and listen to it. But this stuff is fascinating, and the research is really out there for it. And it really is the missing link to so many things. So whatever ails you, think back to the gut, and think back to what you're eating, and think back to your gut health, because naturopathically, that's where it all starts, in my opinion. So thank you for being on today.
You're welcome. The pleasure is all mine. Thank you so much for having me, and be pain-free, people.
Yeah. Awesome. Talk to you soon.
Thanks.